So welcome back. So we've had this big final flourish announcement from the master, the compere, Alan Joyce, and he's on his kind of lap of honour, I don't know what you want to call it, his last lap as CEO. But then essentially what happens is he gets called to, I don't want to sort of over-journalise it, but he's been put on trial by some people.
Hauled before a Senate committee.
Hauled before a Senate committee to be interrogated by his arch nemesis. It's Darth Vader versus Obi-Wan. I don't know which is which. But needless to say, we've got Tony Sheldon, his nemesis, finally one-on-one versus the Joyce. Extraordinary.
Well, not one-on-one.
No,
it was several
true.
on three because Steph Tully and Andrew McGuinness were also there.
So their lightsabers are out. They're staring each other down. There it is, the
They're
final
marching
duel.
towards each other down the street, snapping their fingers.
I don't know if it's a dance-off or a lightsaber duel, but anyway, tell us more.
It should be both.
It should be
We
both.
should have a combination dance-off lightsaber duel sometime. We need to make this happen. So Joyce got called before the Senate Select Committee on the cost of living. There were questions from the chair, Senator Jane Hume, from the Greens, Senator Penny Allman-Payne, questions from Dean Smith, questions from Bridget McKenzie and Matt Canavan. But the main event was Tony Sheldon just absolutely laying into Alan Joyce, and to a lesser extent Steph Tully and Andrew McGuinness, but mainly Alan Joyce because
it's what we've all wanted to see this for a while. This is the heavyweight clash of the Titans.
It's Tony Sheldon with the steel chair. But Joyce and Tully and McGuinness got grilled for 90 minutes by these senators on things like COVID flight credits, on bonuses and executive salaries, on airfares, on cancellations, on Qatar. They spent a lot of time on Qatar. One of the interesting things that Joyce said, he was quizzed about. We've discussed. I don't know if we've discussed on this podcast. We might have done. There's been a lot of them, but the high cancellation rate between Sydney and Melbourne, because Sydney and Melbourne has been seeing some pretty high, a lot of cancellations recently. And, the question was put to Alan Joyce about all these cancellations on Sydney and Melbourne. And essentially what he said was, there are circumstances outside our control at Sydney Airport, ATC issues and weather issues, he said, that are meaning we have to cancel flights. And what he said was, we've got a 3.5% cancellation rate. Would you rather we cancel a daily flight to Darwin or a half-hourly flight to Melbourne? Because if we cancel the flight to Darwin, then people are going to have to stay in Sydney overnight till the next flight the next day. But if we cancel a flight to Melbourne, we can just shuffle people onto a flight half an hour or two later.
Yeah, no, I mean, the first thing to say is obviously you shouldn't be cancelling. Nobody should be cancelling any flights. I will get that out of the way before we...
Well, if there are, in all fairness, if there are circumstances outside Qantas's control, and there have been a lot at Sydney Airport lately, if there are circumstances outside Qantas's control, then it kind of has to cancel some flights.
Now, the problem with this is, in theory, yes, he is clearly right. It's better to give somebody a half an hour delay than to sort of completely write off their trip.
Correct.
But the issue is, and I'm going to give you, and without naming names, I'm going to give you an example that two kind of very senior people in our company a few weeks ago were travelling from Sydney to Melbourne, and the idea was that they'd travel up very early in the morning, go for a few meetings in Melbourne, and then, smash and grab, get out later in the day. And the problem is that their flight got delayed by, I think it was like 4 hours, by which point they obviously missed their meeting, and the whole thing becomes totally pointless. So they say, well, you know what, we're just going to go back to the office. This is a write-off. But they can't get their money back, or they can't because it's about a cancellation, because Qantas or the airline can turn around and go, well, actually, we were able to get you on a flight in a few hours' time. For the Sydney and Melbourne flights, often time is of the essence.
Absolutely.
And the issue here is, and again, there are circumstances outside of Qantas's or outside of airlines' control, but if you've got a situation where I think the cancellation rate can get up to sort of 10%, which I think the last time we looked, it was 2,500 flights.
This was in the first 6 months of 2023. It was around 2,300 flights between Sydney and Melbourne across the major carriers. The July figures from Bitra, it was 388 total cancellations between Sydney and Melbourne in July. So this is across both directions. 8.7% flights from Sydney cancelled, 8.5% from Melbourne cancelled. The long-term cancellation rate as of July was 2.2%.
What I would say, though, is that, and again, I understand that the factors outside of people's control and that Qantas are trying to their credit, use their network to nullify the harm on passengers. But it is coming to something when you have one of the most prestigious air routes in the world that has that many cancellations, and we just kind of accept that. Oh, that's just the way it is. Yep. If you're getting to the stage where that many flights are cancelled on that important business route, that is an absolute disaster. Correct. And I would argue as well that, obviously we may love flying on this show, but it's infrastructure, it's transport, it is whisper it away to get from A to B. How many business meetings have been cancelled? How many deals haven't happened because of this? Yep. I would make the argument that actually having a cancellation rate this high on the most important route in Australia is doing significant damage.
Absolutely it is. And to Joyce's point in the Senate hearing, being that would you rather us cancel a flight to Darwin or cancel one of the half-hourly services to Melbourne, it goes to show the popularity of the route and the fact that people are using it for day trips, business trips, to fly down to Melbourne, have a meeting, do some business, jump back on a plane, fly home, back at home in my own bed. So
I've done those before.
Yep.
Boomerangs, we used to call them.
Yep.
Used to boomerang up to Melbourne down to Melbourne or up to Brisbane.
Yep. I remember when I actually first moved to Australia, I couldn't believe people would just fly somewhere in the morning and fly back later in the day. But that's just part of what we do. Yeah.
So in the case of our work colleagues here, I know for a fact the cancellation was as a result of a Qantas aircraft. They taxied out. There were an indication came on in the cockpit forcing the captain to turn the aircraft back around. So it wasn't a case of they were delayed due to or cancelled due to ATC or things like that. And the only alternative option Qantas could get our colleagues on that day was a flight 4 hours later, which, as you have already said, they'd already missed their meeting. They were on a plane at 6:30 in the morning to have been in Melbourne CBD for 9 a.m. for a meeting at 9:30.
And particularly if it's like a 6:30 flight, then you're probably getting up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning.
Exactly. One of our colleagues lives on the Northern Beaches, so he got up at 4 a.m. that morning to head to the airport. So
you would be. That's the thing. Once you do these things, people are like rightly livid.
Yep.
Well, this is why the good Lord invented Zoom.
Well, I mean, but yeah,
evil word.
We don't use that, right? Word. Now let's move on.
Speaking of cancellations at Sydney Airport, there was more news that we reported on last Thursday regarding this, which is that Sydney Airport has called for this 80-20 use it or lose it rule around the takeoff slots to be tightened to 95-5.
Shall I just do my usual blurb where I explain what the slot rule is? Excuse me.
Look, I'll nip out and grab a drink.
If you want to go to the toilet, now's the time to do it. So, for those of you new to the show, basically, as anyone would realise, you can't have two aircraft take off on the same runway at the same time.
Not with that attitude.
No, you certainly can't, because that would be incredibly dangerous. So, therefore, you have literally take-off time slots. And, of course, some slots are more popular and more lucrative than others. So, for example, flights at kind of peak times, obviously much better than flights kind of in the middle of the day. But there's obviously a lot of competition for those particular times. How do they work out which airline gets the best slots? Well, they use this kind of quite bizarre but worldwide used system called the 80-20 rule. And what this means is if an airline flies a particular service and uses it 80% of the time, then they can keep that particular time slot forever. But the argument against that is it means they can cancel 1 in 5 flights and effectively block out their rivals. So the ACCC a couple of months ago, in a very carefully worded kind of statement, said that these rules kind of can be exploited not naming any names, by larger airlines, I say to sort of stifle competition. And you've got both Bonza and Rex who are trying to kind of get in the game of taking on Virgin and Qantas, who are finding themselves kind of blocked out of the best routes, blocked out of the best times, unable to get a foothold, which is really hampering their growth. So there's been a lot of argument as to whether or not we change that rule. I hope you're both back from doing whatever you've done. For those of you,
I was in my happy place.
yeah, you were both dozing off. And that is the background here. We have to get to the new listeners. So, Sydney, what is Sydney proposing? Talk me through how they would change the 80-20 rule.
So what Sydney wants is, currently it's 80-20. Sydney Airport wants 95-5. So under this rule, an airline would have to fly a slot 95% of the time, 19 times out of 20 to keep the slot. Otherwise, they lose it.
I would say to this, without wanting to try and get into the minds of Sydney Airport, I think they're saying this knowing they'll never get 95-5, but thinking that they have to kind of come out on that to get 90-10. I think 90-10 is probably secretly what they and the other airlines are pushing for, because the argument is with 95-5, you give airlines very little leeway to cancel anything. And the argument from Qantas and Virgin would put forward is that if you're having a 95-5 rule, then you're almost encouraging us to take off when it may not be safe. So you're almost encouraging us to take a gamble. You need some kind of buffer to allow us to safely cancel flights.
I personally think it shouldn't count if it's down to an uncontrollable situation.
Point of order, airlines do already get dispensations for slot usage due to weather. So if there's bad weather,
know that.
if there's bad weather, this is from Sydney Airport's submission to the House Standing Committee on Economics inquiry into promoting economic dynamism, competition, and business formation. There's a mouthful. But in its submission, it says the Sydney Airport said, airlines already get dispensations on slot usage due to weather. So if it's unsafe, obviously don't take off. And what Sydney says is the long-term cancellation rate at Sydney right now is 2.1%. So if you have a 95-5 rule, then that's 2.5 times roughly what the long-term cancellation route is. Sydney's submission says a threshold of 5% for cancellations would give airlines ample buffer for legitimate operational impacts, and if cancellation rates are above this, airlines should be asked to justify why.
Well, one of the interesting things, we've been talking about this now for a few weeks or so, and it feels like there's all this kind of noise from the industry. But
purring.
And purring, of course, yes. But there's not actually been any kind of response from the federal government that suggests they're actually on the brink of moving or changing this policy. So it feels like, given that there's this sort of all this interest but a kind of stagnating lack of action, Sydney Airport have come in here and sort of tried to force people's hand by going, right, here's a solution, here's exactly how this is going to work. Because I don't think the current situation at the moment is sustainable. There's too much anger, and the anger's not going away.
Look, one thing we do really well here in Australia is if it's not broke, don't fix it. And clearly this is broken, and it clearly needs to be looked at. And a policy that came into play 22 or 20 years ago now, or possibly even 30 years ago.
A while.
A long time, is clearly no longer suitable for modern day air travel. So something needs to change, and someone needs to make a change very soon.
And Qantas and Virgin have repeatedly denied any accusation that they are gaming the system, any accusation that they are hoarding slots. In that self-same Senate inquiry the other day, Joyce did say, it's in our financial interest to be flying all the slots that we have. You know, why would we just be cancelling flights willy-nilly when we could be flying people and making money off it? So that's one thing that I believe it was Joyce that said. Certainly someone from Qantas said that. I believe it was Joyce.
Our lawyers are very grateful for your statement there. But no, it's true. They do, both of them have come out and said, why would we do that? This will cost us money.